Yeah, that's working. Good. Okay. We're recording. I can see that. Five, four, three, two, one. Tēnā koutou katoa and welcome to the Hoon. It is Friday the 5th of May. I'm Bernard Hickey with co-host Peter Bale in Spain. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you, Bernard. I just suddenly realised that you certainly you suddenly turn into a sort of disc jockey when you go into this kind of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 mode. You've become Casey Kasem.
Casey Kasem. Oh, yes, we need a top 100 of
Yeah,
geopolitics,
America's
global
top
economy.
40.
Yeah. No, I've developed my radio voice with half a glass of gin and tonic after a long week of work. So I'm really looking forward to this. How are you?
Well,
How are
I have
you?
the usual coffee in, but it's in Spain, and I've just made it. But as I say, have said to you before, there are people here who will have a little brandy with their coffees in the morning, but I'm not yet one of them. But once I've started smoking, 20 or 30 Spanish cigarettes a day, and I have a brandy to start my day, then we'll be off.
You'll have the Casey Kasems as well. That's
That's
great.
right.
Really good.
I'll be talking like this.
And you managed to avoid all the mayhem in London, where there's going to be a coronation over the weekend, apparently.
Is there?
Yeah, and our Prime Minister Chris Hipkins is there, along with the
Yes, I saw he met William the other day.
and he got a sausage roll or two, which he consumed.
Excellent.
That was very kind
Oh
of the
God, I
the
am
new
a bit
king.
worried that Chris Hipkins' whole thing is being a sort of pie eating glasses where wraparound sunglasses wearing person from the hut, and that he's
Yeah,
going
well,
to sort of
apparently
take that persona wherever he goes.
he had to buy a new suit for the coronation, so he went to Barker's.
Of course he did.
Yeah,
Well, that
no,
might be,
it
but I thought
looks good.
Helen Steins would be more his speed, wouldn't it?
I think so. But he's very confident in his own skin and having a good time over there. Apart, of course, from the drama of turning his phone on when he landed in London and it blowing up with Meka Fighter. He's just jumped to Pāti Māori, which shocked everyone.
Do we literally call that waka jumping? Is that what because when I first came back,
Pretty
there was
much.
this strange waka jumping legislation or waka jumping rules. Tell us about that, Bernard? Or are we going to,
Yeah, this was
you know?
designed by Winston Peters and was one of the conditions of getting into government in 2017. This was designed to stop the rebels jumping from one party to another. These are list MPs during the term of government, because this is what happened to Winston Peters in the late 1990s. And when you've got a bunch of wildcards in your party who you probably don't even know yourself, you want to try and stop them from disintegrating halfway through the term. And this meant that if you did next, you were kicked out of Parliament according to the waka jumping rules. And what has shocked everyone is that Meka Whaitiri has clearly jumped from the Labour Party and says she's going to stand for Te Pāti Māori and Ikaroa Rāwhiti in the election. But the way it's being done with the Speaker means that she doesn't have to
Oh,
resign as
really?
an MP. And it's all very curious and vague, and everyone's now demanding that the letters be discussed in public, and it's all very, frankly, distracting and
Well, I think they should, though, shouldn't they?
painful.
Because one of the interesting things about this, presumably, is, and I have been tracking it, of course, is that it kind of moves some of the power from the Labour Maori caucus into the Maori part to Pāti Maori,
And it
which
definitely will
makes
strengthen
yeah.
their role as the kingmaker after the election. Given that they, in the latest poll, the Roy Morgan poll at least, that's the most recent one we've seen, they had 4.5%. And if they get 3 seats, which now looks quite likely, we're talking 5 or 6 MPs, and that's more than enough to hold the balance of power. And
Yeah.
if Raf Manji manages to cook up a deal for Ireland, that could create quite a grouping of power brokers in the middle to decide who gets into power. And that will
Yeah, it's a
be,
really interesting step because it does. I mean, all of those people who argue that the existing Maori caucus is too strong or too influential over the rest of Labor are going to get a hell of a shock when they realise that that same power is going to be exercised actually by Te Pāti Māori, aren't they?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why the Prime Minister, expressed disappointment but didn't really unload because
Exactly.
he may
Exactly.
have to talk with Mika Whaitiri in about 5 months' time and ask her nicely if he can stay in government. So that was an excitement and a scoop from Te Ao Māori News on Wednesday night, which was interesting. And it's about that time, I think, to welcome in Julianne Genter.
Yeah.
Welcome into
Speaking of power,
again.
speaking of power brokers,
Yes. Lovely to see you, Julianne, again on the Hoon, a regular and welcome guest. Are you calling us from Wellington? Is that right?
I just got back to Wellington and I'm here at my kitchen table. So hopefully the lighting is not ideal. And I've got
excellent. Do you have a gin and tonic?
I have one of those brain performance drinks, supposedly with black.
Of course you do.
No
If
product placement.
if your brain was any stronger though, Julianne, we'd be in real trouble. You'd be Prime Minister already.
And just dribble a bit of gin in. That will help, I think.
I've just got a
Julianne,
sick toddler on the couch. Just warning you in case I
no,
get
I mean this will turn into a viral hit
to help
when
with the.
your toddler crawls all over your back and intervenes in the Hoon. That will be good.
Exactly.
It's lovely to see you, and in particular, a big week in transport news as the transport spokesperson for the Green Party, and also as one of the founders and driving forces of the Clean Car Discount Scheme. That was the big news this week. The government decided to change it. What did you make of the changes, which in effect make it more expensive to buy a Ford Ranger and a Toyota Hilux, but also means the rebates you get for a Tesla or for a Leaf are smaller, and some of the hybrids, both new and used, don't get rebates anymore. This was because it was too successful, apparently. So what did you think of the changes?
I remember when we first talked about this policy, we were talking with the advisors at the Ministry of Transport, and people were saying, "Oh, what happens if it's too successful and it's not raising enough revenue to cover its cost?" And I said, well, that's a really good problem to have because that means that we're doing better on emissions reduction than what you're forecasting. And the design of the system is such that you should be able to make it cover its costs over time by adjusting the prices on the high polluting vehicles. And I think that's where we haven't seen enough action, and that's why there is a gap. It's because they started giving out the rebates 9 months before they brought in the fees, so you had people panic buying utes for about 9 months. And of course, a steep drop-off in the purchase of high polluting vehicles right after the program came in. So I think it's fair enough to put up the fees. The fees are very low in New Zealand compared to other countries with fee bates, like extremely low. In France, the highest polluting vehicles pay €30,000 for a fee, which is about $60,000.
I suppose, Peter, you haven't seen too many double cab utes in Spain.
I haven't seen too many double cab utes in Spain, but I am driving a diesel Volkswagen, which reminded me that diesel is still very popular in Southern Europe. But as you know, I was in Oslo last week, where 79% of new cars registered last year were electric. Norway has really gone to town on this. I mean, of course, yes, as people said last week, Norway has a lot of money from oil, oddly, and it also has a somewhat higher tax regime than New Zealand does. But they're really serious about it, and I think the point here, though, to some extent, Julian Burnett, is that New Zealand isn't actually currently serious about any of these policies.
Well, Norway does, and I would say it's not like they're using oil money to fund the EV subsidies in Norway. They have high taxes on all vehicles, and they simply remove the taxes on EVs to accelerate uptake, along with other complementary policies. And we do need some more complementary policies to support more EVs here in New Zealand because we don't have the charging infrastructure sorted.
Yeah, absolutely not.
No, the distribution networks
don't you detect though quite a lot of backsliding by the government, particularly since Chris Hipkins came to power, which I understand politically, but there's a tremendous amount of backsliding going on these relatively weak existing commitments because of potential political unpopularity, right?
It's so interesting because there was polling released a couple weeks ago that showed that the clean car discount, including the fee component, was popular with voters, including a majority of people who identify themselves as National Party voters. So I thought that was really interesting, and it is probably for that reason they haven't completely jettisoned the policy, but they could lean in a bit more. You know, would we have done the exact same changes to the clean car discount? I have to look at, you know, more detail on the advice they got. They did ask us what we thought, and I think they did make some changes based on what we said. But, you know, we just have to keep going even further and faster in this direction. And of course, that's why I would argue we need a much stronger Green Party in the next government so that they can show some better leadership on these issues and implement successful, effective policies.
So electric cars are one part of the story, but the other one is public transport. And this week we've seen Rail-mageddons. When you think about this story in tabloid terms, which sometimes you have to, Rail-mageddons in Wellington and Auckland, starting with Kiwi Rail's one single rail tracking machine, which they bought in 1980 or 1981, breaking down. And a whole bunch of other problems with scheduling means that at the very least, the rail rang up the Greater Wellington Regional Council and said, our machine broke down, we haven't checked the tracks, you're going to have to call off a bunch of commuter rail services. Is that okay? And no, it wasn't okay with the Greater Wellington Regional Council. That's in Wellington, and then today there's been a whole bunch of cancellations, more mayhem here. This is on top of all the bus cancellations in Auckland. What do you make of what's happened with public transport and these services, both for buses and trains, Julianne, in the last week or two?
I mean, the truth is that previous governments' decisions decades ago have put us in the situation we're in right now, both with respect to rail and bus contracts and bus drivers. So it's a really awkward position for the current government, who has tried to prioritize public transport. I don't believe that Labour has actually transferred as much money to the operations of public transport services as they need to deliver good services. But, you know, some of what we're facing today is the result of the previous national government and even the previous Labour and national governments. So, but it's no excuse. Like, people are going to lose confidence in the public transport system and they're not going to be able to use it. So patronage is up in Wellington. It's back to 97% of what it was pre-COVID, which is good, despite all the cancellations and ghost buses. But I really think that the government needs to look hard at the current structure of Kiwi Rail as a vertically integrated state-owned enterprise, whether that is actually the appropriate vehicle to deliver the improvements that we need to the tracks, because they're very focused on freight. They have to be. And it doesn't really make sense to me to have everything vertically integrated. Most European countries with excellent train services have an organization that owns, maintains, operates, develops the tracks and the network. And then you might have a publicly owned operator for either passenger or freight, but often it's open to other operators as well. And I think that's something we should be looking at very seriously here.
It sounds a bit public transport operating model, though. Do you really want privately owned operators of companies, obviously separate from the tracks? Having lived in Britain and, you know, dealt with Virgin Rail and Thameslink, and they're all swear words in my lexicon. So is that really the best?
Well, and most likely for passenger services, they're not going to be commercial. And so they will be, so yeah, then it makes sense to have a publicly owned operator. But I still think it makes sense to have some separation between the tracks and the operations, because Kiwi Rail, as it is now, is operating like a private operator in many respects. And it is focused, because of the state-owned enterprise legislation, on returning a dividend to the government, which is not the thing that we really need it to do. You know, making cash off our freight operations is not is not the thing that gives us the best value out of our transport system. So I'd say it should be a crown entity, and we probably need a separate, a separate focus on passenger from freight.
Now, the other big news this week was doing an analysis of bank profits, which showed New Zealand's banks are the most profitable in the world. We have the most expensive market in the world. We've got the best rugby team, especially the best women's rugby team. But but we've also got the most profitable banks. Yeehaw! And they're not only the most profitable, but also they're the least risky. So when you think about investment, normally you think an investment which returns you lots of money is a bit like that because it's a little bit risky. There's a volatility about their profits, up and down. But that's not the case with the banks. They haven't made losses for 14 years, and their return on equity of around about 13%, even though it's the same as some of the other companies on the NZX, they are also much more volatile and smaller companies. And the Reserve Bank didn't come out and say, gouged by the banks. They just said, oh, this is interesting information. We quite like the banks to be much nicer to people and use those high profits to retain their social license. But what did you think, Julianne, of those revelations and what we've seen this week from BNZ?
We've been calling for an excess profits tax as a tool in the government's toolkit, and it makes more sense than ever right now. The banks did exceedingly well during the COVID period. They never took a hit, and they actually saw increasing asset prices. And now, even if house prices are coming down off the boil, their profits are increasing because of higher interest rates, which has nothing to do with how they operate as a business. It's even Margaret Thatcher brought in an excess profits tax on the banks when interest rates were going up in the 80s in Britain. So I think it's really hard to justify our inaction. And I know that the Minister of Finance did ask the government for advice on this, and of course the classic advice from the public service in New Zealand is like, oh, couldn't possibly do that. I hate the line that we want a profitable banking sector because it means it's stable. There's a difference between profitable and sustainable and the kind of excess profits that we're seeing right now. That's just sucking value out of our country, and it's not good.
And another way to look at it is to have a market study of the banking sector. Of building materials, groceries, and retail fuel. And Duncan Webb, the Commerce Minister, has said that he is looking potentially at banking and maybe insurance as the next market studies. What do you think?
Look, I'm not opposed to a market study, but I mean, we haven't really seen particularly ambitious recommendations come out of those. And I think we need action now. We've actually had some of the international institutions like the IMF and others calling for, or the OECD, calling for the use of excess profit tax with respect to energy. But I think given what we know about banks in New Zealand, there's a really good case for it right now in New Zealand. And that would help offset some of the very expensive bills that the government has, both paying back borrowing that they used to get us through COVID, and now responding to the severe weather events that we've caused us to rebuild. It just makes sense. I don't see any advantage in continuing to let the banks just rake it in, and they know they're exposed, and frankly, they're not in a position to do anything about it. I don't think, I don't believe that trying to make the system more competitive is going to solve the problem at this point.
Julianne Genter, the Green MP and spokesperson for Transport and Infrastructure. Thank you very much for being on the Hoon. Lovely to see you again.
Lovely to see you.
Cheers. Well, it's time now to zip down to Dunedin with Professor Robert Patman from the University of Otago, our regular rockstar guest. Robert, thank you very much for coming on to the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Bernard. Hello, Peter.
Yeah,
Hi, Robert. How are you? I'm in Spain. I'm in Spain today, so I can.
Wow, you were in Oslo when we last spoke.
What's? That's right. Yeah, I'm trying to use more carbon than anybody has emitted in their lives, basically, in one trip.
Yeah. Well, it's been a big week. No, it's been a big week in the dance between the United States and China, and whether New Zealand becomes the grass that gets crushed by the dancing elephants, and in particular whether New Zealand joins up to the Pillar Two version of AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US agreement on defence, not to have the nuclear submarines, but to help get hold of the technology, some of the high tech things that these countries are dealing with, and also whether Chris Hipkins turns up at NATO and gets all friendly with NATO. My understanding is that Nanaia Mahuta went up to China last month and was told in no uncertain terms the Chinese did not want any of that. And there are a few worries around about whether there's fallout from this. Robert, what's your feeling about, how if there is a debate going on within the government and within the cabinet between MFAT, MPI, and all of these players about just how we do the dance and try not to get squashed by the elephants?
Well, I think we've got to protect the integrity of our foreign policy, which has been relatively successful. And we have been noted by our friends in the Indo-Pacific as being having a principled, independent policy, and not on occasion being quite prepared to take hard decisions, such as pursuing non-nuclear security in the face of opposition from a superpower, the United States, and then condemning an illegal invasion by the United States of Iraq, and well, not so much condemning it, but also not endorsing it. And so I think New Zealand is seen in diplomatic terms as not being the same as Australia. And the difficulty for, I think, New Zealand here is that it needs to take a step in relation to AUKUS that mustn't compromise, I think, or lead to the suggestion that we are necessarily in lockstep with the United States, the UK, and Australia. We have a core strategic objective of diversifying our economic links in the Indo-Pacific, and it's no secret that many members of ASEAN, and indeed the bulk of the Pacific Island states, are lukewarm about AUKUS. Now, let's be quite clear about this. This is not a question of being soft on China. Good strategy is about the effective relationship between means and ends. The question is, does AUKUS actually represent a serious and credible counterbalance to China's growing assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific? And myself and Professor Al Gillespie recently argued that we believe, on balance, that given that New Zealand has a different worldview, we think the advantages of staying detached from AUKUS outweigh the merits of being inside it. So I think there are real risks for New Zealand if it tries to have its cake and eat it. That is, it champions the norm of non-nuclear security, but is part and parcel, or seen as a member, an associate member, a Pillar 2 member, to use the jargon, of an organisation, or a partnership, I should say, which is in the process of transferring nuclear technology from the United States and the UK to Australia, which is currently non-nuclear. So I know this is to construct nuclear-powered, not nuclear-armed submarines, but I think perceptions matter in international politics, and it seems to me that we have to be careful, because there's another issue here, and I'd be interested to hear Bernard, your views on this, both of you. We don't know what's going to happen in the United States in the 2024 election.
Yeah.
There is a risk here, as Paul Keating pointed out, that if New Zealand joined AUKUS as a non-nuclear member, we could find ourselves as an associate member of a security partnership headed by Mr. Trump or Mr. DeSantis, neither of whom have much regard for the very thing that AUKUS was set up to defend, which is the international rules-based order. Of course, we don't want to just defend it; we want to actually strengthen it, and that's where New Zealand is separate from the three members of AUKUS. We actually want to see reform of the Security Council. Like
Yeah, that's
President
one of
Zelensky.
the
So,
issues
yeah,
is that
yeah.
we jump on the horse and then the horse suddenly becomes some sort of rabid lion. And I'm curious too about, we're obviously trying to diversify our trade. Chris Hipkins has just signed overnight a slightly faster free trade agreement with the United Kingdom, with Rishi Sunak. No doubt all the friendly talk about AUKUS has helped there. And he's been talking a bit more with the Europeans and with NATO. And he's going to go, it seems, to the big NATO conference in July and potentially could be invited to this shindig going on in Sydney in a couple of weeks' time, where Joe Biden comes to Sydney with the heads of the so-called Quad, which is like AUKUS but with India added. And I wonder how far Chris Hipkins and the government should go in coaching up to NATO as well, and zipping over to Sydney and standing around the sidelines there.
Well, Bernard, I think on balance, New Zealand should steer clear of AUKUS, but it's quite consistent with New Zealand's worldview, which is a belief in multilateral security, to have a close relationship with NATO. And so I think there's a real risk for New Zealand joining AUKUS. I think it would seriously dent, extort if you like, the international perceptions of our independent non-nuclear security stance. I think there's, on balance, given the fact that we've always argued for a multilateral approach to security, there's comparatively little risk in developing our relationship with NATO. And, China doesn't like AUKUS and it doesn't like NATO, but, I think successive prime ministers have made it clear that while we're happy to do business with China, China can't treat us in a sort of master-servant relationship. We can't be backtracking on our core values. And look, we're increasingly located in an interdependent world where small and middle powers have more weight than previously. It's not because great powers lack power. It's just that many of the problems confronting us now can't be solved unilaterally by anyone. So that gives some agency to small and middle powers. And I think New Zealand has a distinctive worldview, which is based on strengthening the international rule of law, not on just defending it or upholding the status quo, which the UK and the United States are very fond of, because they are privileged members of the Security Council and they can block anything they don't like by exercising the veto, as can, of course, France, China, and Russia. So we want to go beyond that. We actually want to see the Security Council, I think, more functional and more responsive than it currently is.
Do you get the sense, Robert, that this is a priority for the New Zealand government? That this, I think we felt perhaps that with Jacinda Ardern there was a real priority. As you said, Nanaia Mahuta went to China, got this message, but we seldom hear publicly from Nanaia Mahuta. And so it's quite difficult to tell sometimes whether we have a strong or a weak foreign policy.
I have a feeling that Nanaia Mahuta gave an interesting interview, I think about 6 days ago, with Simon Shepherd. And I think she was much more cautious in her statements on AUKUS than some of her colleagues. Although, to be fair, both Andrew Little and the Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, have said they had no problem exploring discussions about Pillar 2 membership, which is quite different from saying that they're negotiating to join. I do think we face a momentous decision over what seems to be quite concerted pressure from the UK, the United States, and Australia over this AUKUS question.
And China's pushing back. China's pushing back too. My understanding, without anything public that I can refer to, is that Nanaia Mahuta got a dressing down in China when she went.
I think the bottom line question, though, here is: do we support an enhanced security arrangement between 3 English-speaking countries to try to counter Chinese influence. Is that the best mechanism for doing so? Many countries in the Indo-Pacific are extremely skeptical that Britain, the United States, and Australia can, and people like Paul Keating echo this, is the best vehicle for doing so. Countries which are very critical of AUKUS have no illusions about Chinese assertiveness. Countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam. But they don't see AUKUS as the mechanism, nor do some of our allies in NATO, like France and Germany. So
finally, Robert, on Ukraine, what did you make of this apparent drone attack and where we are in the war, which looks like it's about to kick off again?
Well, I think my take on what's happened is no better than anyone else's, because it's an extraordinary episode. I personally think that Mr. Putin, of course, with his intelligence background, he's had a track record of having false flag operations. You had someone on your program, I think, last year, Bernard, who Peter was responsible for bringing on the program, who's a Russian specialist, a journalist. His name escapes me for the moment. And he was making the point that he had little doubt that Mr. Putin used a false flag operation when he became prime minister, and he had about 2% polls, and the polls then meant
that
much
was David
more than they do
Satter,
now. And of course, unfortunately, 300 people were blown up in flats around Moscow. So we can't rule out the possibility that Mr. Putin has, created some sort of episode. What is, I think, clear? To respond to your question as precisely as I can, I think whoever launched that drone did so within Moscow. Whether it be a partisan group or whether it be the FSB. And I suppose you saw the video clips. There were two people handily placed on the roof when the drone was intercepted. And the drone did not seem to be hitting the Kremlin. It missed its target.
That's right.
Before it exploded.
That footage, the footage of it being hit did look a little bit too good to be true.
Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult to say. I think the Russian government has really been unnerved by a whole series of explosions this week in Russia, which have not got massive media coverage, but they're certainly getting some coverage on Twitter from people deeply interested in the Ukraine conflict.
Well, with any luck, Robert, he'll be going to South Africa and getting arrested because of his ICC thing, but I'm afraid not, it would appear.
Yeah.
I wouldn't bank on that.
No. We'll keep an eye on this. Robert, thank you very much for coming on the show. Great to see and hear you.
Robert.
That's
Talk to you soon.
lovely. Now, I'd like to welcome onto the Hoon David Hall, who is the Climate Policy Director at Tohu and a long-time thinker and academic on the political economy of climate change. David, welcome on to the Hoon.
Kia ora, Bernard. And it's just Toha.
Toha, sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Good. Tell us what Toha is for a start.
Yeah, Toha is developing an impact investment marketplace, so matching supply and demand for environmental impact with a particular focus on regenerative agriculture and land use. And I've been doing a lot of work recently on preparing the ground for biodiversity and especially what we call nature-based solutions, where you restore forests or wetlands and so on, and you get the benefits of both biodiversity but also climate adaptation, because those sorts of land uses increase the resilience of catchments and landscapes. And you also get a little bit of carbon sequestration come along for the ride too.
Can you give us an example of how this might work, how a farmer or do some things that reduce our emissions or sequester some carbon that some other group invests in that project to come up with a better net result?
Sure. I mean, front of mind at the moment is obviously the East Coast and the events after Cyclone Gabriel, and that's really revealed and exposed how vulnerable those landscapes are, and the absence of forest, which used to be there, is a contributing factor, and so are the drainage of wetlands for pastoral agriculture. And so restoring permanent, potentially unharvested or selectively harvested forest back into the upper catchments creating wetlands in the lower catchments to help with water regulation and so on. It can't necessarily stop flooding events from cyclones like we've seen, but it can at least reduce the flows, slow them down, reduce some of those risks. And then when you think through those risks, they have material implications for all sorts of entities. There's asset owners downstream. There's banks that have mortgages in farms. There's insurance on farm and so on, and they're all also exposed in various ways to events like this, and they are currently gathering more knowledge about that exposure through the climate risk disclosure process, where the 200 largest institutions in New Zealand now have mandatory requirements to understand their climate-related risks, and so that creates let's call it enlightened self-interest to restore these catchments and to reduce those risks where possible. And the challenge for us at Toha is to come up with impact verification products so that investors know what they're getting when they're investing money. They know that they've made a land use change. There's wetland where there didn't used to be wetland. There's forest where there didn't used to be forest. And that enables those transactions so that some of those players can start to reduce the risks in their value chains by investing in nature-based solutions.
David,
It's quite
Peter here. How big are these? How important do you think these questions are, or this idea of sort of making it economically active, making it economically valuable, to getting public acceptance of this? Because one of the interesting things that's happening in Europe is a really strong rise, particularly by farming groups and politically active farming groups, against some of the net zero provisions. Do you think that this economic aspect of giving them a greater incentive, without necessarily subsidies, but just showing the potential economic benefit of this, is part of the persuasion tactics?
Absolutely. I mean, the agricultural community is diverse, and there's some who, don't need persuasion. Many farmers and landowners completely understand their exposure to these sorts of events and don't need a huge amount of persuasion. However, they're time limited. They can have constrained cash flow, and so things like a payment system can help as an enabler for them to do more and for them to fulfill their aspirations around land stewardship, because many farmers would love to do more than they currently can. And so payment mechanisms for biodiversity or for adaptation can help with that. And indeed there is a tradition of that. After Cyclone Bowler, there was the East Coast Forestry Program, which evolved into the Erosion Control Funding Program. So these sorts of funding programs and payment programs do exist. And then they can serve as an incentive for those who don't have those motivations already. Yeah. And so
is there a connection to carbon credits, David? I mean, where we fear that this, the market isn't quite functioning yet, as far as both international carbon credits go, but also domestic.
Yeah, I think of these as complementary instruments. I think from the ideal of a public policy economist, you'd probably want to have distinct instruments which are overlapping but addressing these different issues and driving progress towards those different objectives. So you would have an instrument in relation to carbon, as we currently do through the emissions trading scheme, but alongside that you might have something that does a similar role for biodiversity, perhaps adaptation as well. And landowners could potentially access different revenue streams, and then those revenue streams could add together. So something like a native forest might be able to access a biodiversity payment on top of the carbon payment, and that would help with the opportunity cost that currently exists because native forest grows slower, and so especially in the first couple of decades, and so the returns aren't as great through carbon revenue as they are for faster growing exotics. So if there was a biodiversity payment there, it would potentially reduce that opportunity cost and make native forest a more viable land use option.
So a sort of a buy the burger and would you like fries with that sort of deal. I'm curious, David, the idea of a market solving a problem and dealing with this, fundamental issue of externalities, i.e., the costs that are borne in the future by someone else because of a economic activity where the benefits are privatized by the owner of the land in particular or the forest. And this seems like a really interesting idea, but the problem, of course, is it's all about market design and how well you structure things so that there aren't a whole bunch of free riders and exemptions and things. And I see that today there's a report that the carbon price has dropped to $53. And over the last 2 or 3 months, we've heard that the government chose slightly lower petrol prices over a tougher emissions trading scheme, which seems to have blown up confidence in the entire scheme, at least. What do you think of the politics at the moment of the emissions trading scheme going into an election, and whether it actually is, worth trying to save?
The politics are obviously incredibly fraught for an economic instrument coming up to an election where taxation and spending are, firebrand issues, essentially. The Labour Party doesn't want to leave itself vulnerable to those sorts of attacks. And if they are contemplating things like a capital gains tax, then they probably want to save the political capital to spend on something like that rather than, new or increased taxes for things like emissions. And so, these pricing instruments always have to walk a really difficult line. They have to, it's a little bit of a Goldilocks problem. They need to be, just high enough that they're driving some behavior change, but not so high that they're creating a major political backlash that politicians are unwilling to deal with. And I think, that's the explanation for why Cabinet didn't accept the Climate Change Commission's advice, because they had recommended setting the cost containment reserve trigger very high, and I think there was uncertainty about how that would play out in market behaviour. And I think Cabinet, given that uncertainty, would be reluctant to sign off on anything that potentially induced the price to skyrocket upwards when inflation is high. So in some regards, it's no surprise really that they declined the Commission's advice. And I think, perhaps we need to think more around stability and certainty, because, to your point, should we have the ETS? I mean, the ETS is driving behavior change amongst businesses and industry. I've worked with companies and they are making those cost benefit analyses using the emissions trading scheme price, and they are starting to make those investments.
Wouldn't you feel a right mug though if you'd assumed $100 or $150 and then you looked at the price today and saw 53 and thought, oh, what a waste?
I would assume that this is volatility, though. I think it'll have to creep up, and obviously the Commission and, well, indeed government is looking at ways to improve the ETS, especially around the inclusion of forestry and the role that it's playing in regards to creating another supply of units and an uncontrolled supply of units presently. So I think in the long term assumption, there's the government really needs the ETS price to move up. I just wonder whether, in the way that they control that price corridor, they might need to favour mechanisms which have some certainty around them, like the fixed price option that they used to use. It creates a lot of certainty rather than this kind of up and down, which makes it really hard for decision makers to.
David, who else is thinking about your organisation? Who else in the banking sector perhaps is doing this? I mean, are you seeing the big New Zealand banks, which Bernard talked about at the top of the hour, being the most profitable in the world? Are they moving into this sector, or is it being left to startups and essentially like Tohu?
Toha, yes, they
Tohu, sorry.
definitely no problem. They definitely are moving into this space, and I was involved a couple of years ago with the Sustainable Finance Forum, which was convened by the Aotearoa Circle, and so that was a working group really with a number of with the major banks, insurers, and other financial sector actors. And one of the outcomes of that was to create a roadmap, and another outcome was to create Toitu Tahua, the Centre for Sustainable Finance, as a home and a champion for movement in this space. So there is progress being made, and as I said, they're preparing their climate risk disclosures presently. Some of the major banks have already gone down that path, and that's something that hopefully we'll see greater granularity and sophistication evolving through that process year on year. But these are large institutions, and they've got lots of different incentives, and these organizations will have a sustainability office which is heading in one direction, but then there's the core business which may well be heading in other directions. And you wouldn't assume that there's one single voice or one single motivation in any of these institutions, and that's part of the challenge for transitions generally is how the new can become the incumbent. And these new ways of looking at things are emerging in all these different institutions and gathering momentum, but it'll take time.
I can't help feeling, though, that the climate now is moving faster than the politics. The reports we're hearing about record low ice levels in the Antarctic, record high temperatures in the Pacific, atmospheric rivers. We're in one right now as we speak in Auckland. You got to feel it. I've got a feeling that now the rubber hits the road, or we get run over. And it's great to see you doing that work at Toha. Thank you very much, David Hall.
Thank you, David.
Thanks,
from
Peter.
Toha.
Thanks,
Lovely.
Peter. Cheers.
Now, from the climate to the technology, we've got Ben Reid joining us. Ben, I'm a huge admirer of Ben's Substack, Memia, which from New Zealand looks around the world at the big changes in technology and tries to think about what they mean for us here and how things are changing. Welcome into the Hoon, Ben.
Fantastic. Kia Bernard, kia Peter. I'm a regular viewer, so nice to be on the other side of the camera for once.
Yeah, you've jumped the species barrier.
Yeah.
That's right. Ben, there's some big things happening in AI. It feels like it's the moment for AI, and it seems more substantial than crypto's moment or the Web3 moment or whatever it is. There's some really big stuff going on. Just in the last month or so, we've seen all sorts of tech luminaries get together and say, "Oh, we're scared. This is moving too fast for us even. We like to move things fast and break things, but we're a little bit worried that the AI is going to move too fast and break us." Yeah. What do you think of these various calls to suspend some of the development of AI? And is it really that much of a worry?
Well, unbundle that question. So, I mean, to your point just now, David, about climate change accelerating, and I think I spent a lot of the last few years thinking that the biggest thing on the horizon was the climate, and then suddenly, just in the last 6 months, not even 6 months, it's like sort of 4 or 5 months, the advances in generative AI, which have always been happening, in the background. And I mean, I've been involved in this space for years, but it's just suddenly hit the mainstream. So OpenAI's ChatGPT has opened everybody's eyes, and it's more of just the rapid, not just the pace of technological advancement, but the pace of adoption and absorption by people. So ChatGPT went to 100 million users in about two months, and that's the fastest growing technology app in history by a long chalk. And so you've actually the awareness of this has built out as people have just tried it and seen it working, and it is quite spectacular now to have free or $20 a month access to GPT-4 model and a whole bunch of AI tools that are growing around that. So to your point about AI safety, I mean, there's the question is sort of many faceted and many timelines. So on Horizon 1 right now, we have questions around AI in terms of automation of jobs. I mean, our game, right? So I mean, I'm using it all the time for summarization and for sort of playing around with words and so on. And so how long until most of journalism is automated? And I saw a colleague, a New Zealand colleague, I can't remember who, saying that they'd done some experiments with it, and it's made us all very productive, but it's never going to put us out of a job. I wouldn't make that statement myself. I'm quite, in some ways, quite looking forward to being put out of a job. But the productivity dividend is going to be massive in the short term. It's going to make us all individually, in information work, massively more productive.
Do you think, though, it's going to be good for us? And, John Maynard Keynes said back in the 20s, with all this technology change, it's going to be brilliant. The machines will do the work and we'll just work for 20 or 30 hours a week and we'll be rich and it'll be great. But didn't quite work out like that.
Yeah. I mean, there's the question of, who's actually moving the hamster wheel, powering the hamster wheel that we all run on. And
Hamsters.
Yeah, hamsters. And it actually looks, in some ways, it's this global capitalist system that we run to, and we've got this sort of money, imagination, creation machine that creates this debt that we've all got to then run really hard to pay off. And so, arguably, this is just the next generation of the logical consequence written.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ben, that you should mention journalism, and because that's obviously the area I'm in, and I've been writing quite a bit for a thing called the International News Media Association about AI. And it's very clear to me, having been just a couple of weeks ago to a conference in Italy about this area, that there are immense numbers of back office type tasks, for example, search engine optimization, that are going to be so much easier, so much faster, so much accurate. Also things like viewed studies and so on. But there is still a high accuracy problem with actually publishing straight out from ChatGPT. Yeah. I mean, I think it's 5 out of 15 attribution links to the sources on average are incorrect at the moment.
Oh, look, I mean, that is the the challenge with this first generation of technology as it's gone into the wild, is that it does hallucinate, right? So understanding how it works under the covers, it's sort of basically a big prediction engine, and it will predict with it will create a phrase with incredible confidence that is completely fictional. So it's not a search engine as such, but it is being combined. So Microsoft and Google are both integrating this chat technology with their search engines, and so you're seeing already sort of hybrid options where you can reference the facts. Yeah.
You mentioned that this is. I was thinking of the last fastest growing app, which was WhatsApp, which was bought at that time by Mark Zuckerberg for $18 billion. In a sense, this experiment is going on in real time, in front of all of us, and it's actually it's so disruptive. For example, to Google. I mean, one of the reasons I think one of Google's primary AI thinkers, Geoffrey Hinton, resigned was because he's nervous about the speed at which Google is moving, because it sees a competitive threat to its core business model of search.
Yes,
and so taking away some of the guardrails.
Yeah, and there's the question about guardrails. So Hinton is sort of known as the godfather of AI. I mean, he was British academic and basically moved to Toronto and sort of built up a leading sort of. He's the inventor of the backpropagation algorithm, which is basically what a lot of the neural networks today are still based on. And so him and Joshua Bengio and Jan LeCun. Jan LeCun heads up Meta AI now. The three of them were awarded the sort of 2018 Turing Award, which is like the Nobel Prize for technology. But so he resigned this week. I mean, at the age of 75, and so retirement was, I mean, he actually mentioned,
Slacker.
Time to retire maybe. But went out with a bang and did mention about AI safety. So I would say his concerns about AI safety are more in that Horizon 2
But it is
sphere
about being
where,
pushed, isn't it? The speed is being driven hugely by commercial concerns.
yes,
by
commercial, well,
incumbents.
but then also
Microsoft sees an
military.
opportunity.
Also
Yeah.
military technology. So, a lot of signals intelligence now, is using these models to, interpret and provide much more accelerated intelligence in the field. And so, the capitalism may be driving it right now, and competition, but it's always been, driven by military technology. I mean, I would love to see someone calling for a 6-month moratorium. We'll just have a 6-month pause on military investment. Thank you. And no one's doing that. But so for those, Hinton's concern is that, when this falls in, any technology can be used for good or for bad. But if it falls into, the hands of a Putin or a Kim Jong-il, then, what potentially could they use it for? And I think there's quite realistic concerns that military use of this technology does lead to, for example, just generative AI combined with biology designs a hyper infectious virus that makes COVID look like
more than just the Pope wearing a Balenciaga puffer jacket. From a national point of view, if you look at New Zealand, because this is something I looked at when I was helping stuff with something. Does New Zealand need to consider creating a large language model in and about New Zealand? I mean, do we need an equivalent of the Icelandic DNA genetic map for New Zealand?
So I would err on that side. I think what we're witnessing at the moment is the concentration of power of these technologies into United States big tech and Chinese big tech, and not a lot of diffusion beyond that. The flip side to that story is the escape of Meta's Llama model, which is like a GPT-4, probably not quite as effective, but not far off it, which escaped into the wild in March.
Escaped into the wild. What does that
they
mean?
basically published it. They published it under an academic use license, and then someone basically put it out onto BitTorrent, and so anyone could get it. And I think Jan LeCun, who is another, as I say, was another recipient of the Turing Award. He thinks that actually open sourcing this technology is the way that you create a more even Darwinian equilibrium of the measure and the countermeasure as it goes forward. So there's now this explosion.
Out in the wild,
explosion of open source. Yeah.
Can you imagine creating, though, and I think maybe we should find out somebody to create it, a large language model about Aotearoa, which included Te Reo, the 150 years of New Zealand media, the Alexander Turnbull Library. Really, it's a
I
way
think
of just turning
absolutely
on the spigot now.
Yeah, absolutely. And this comes more to the point of national sovereignty in that we have really ceded quietly quite large parts of our national sovereignty in terms of most of government, most of our industry now runs on big US tech cloud data centers, hosted offshore. And while that's not a bad thing, it does, create a single point of failure if geopolitically, something were to happen. So, I think that, we've lost capability to build the full stack of technology. And I think, that basically building up that capability.
I think we're going to advocate for the Hoon will advocate for a national New Zealand LLM, Aotearoa LLM.
Yeah. And it's very soon you'll be able to run them.
Stack.
Yeah, you'll be Kaka stack and you'll be able to run it on your iPhone. Yeah.
Or
your open source Android. Yeah.
Look, the Kaka stack. I've got that. The Kaka stack on Substack. Thank you very much, Ben, for being on the show.
Please come back again sometime.
Yeah, and there's no doubt going to be plenty more really fascinating implications of AI. And if I had young children now, I'd be, pointing them in that direction and saying, tell me what this means, apart from anything else. But get ready for a job or whatever it is that it changes your world is going to change your world.
Well, as usual, the advice is usually just become a hairdresser.
Try
and find a plumber or an electrician, right? So
exactly.
No, that's a good point. But it does sometimes I have to shake my head and think, when I first was a journalist, I trained with a typewriter and some carbon paper. And Peter, when you worked as a journalist, you were giving carbons to
Yeah.
sub-editors to take downstairs to a printer
Yeah.
to put bits of lead in trays.
Well,
Is that right?
unfortunately, men of mine went directly onto a spike in them, which was literally a sort of sword in the middle of the
I-
subs table.
Well, just moving forward, so just this week I had a story in my newsletter that there's new research now that's able to basically decode the language centers of your brain with reasonably high accuracy and understand the gist of what you're thinking. And
Jesus,
then using
I hope
large
that doesn't
language
happen
models.
to
So
mine, and certainly it can't be published because
Oh
mine
my
is all
God.
over the place.
If my thinking escapes into the wild, I'm in deep trouble.
your thinking escapes in the wild pretty much twice daily,
It's
Bernard,
true.
and
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
great.
Yeah, you can't be stopped. Hey, Ben, lovely to see you. And thank you
Fantastic.
very
Thanks for
much.
having me.
Huge fan again, and I recommend Mimia as a Substack to read. That's lovely. Peter, really good to have you on this week, all the way from Spain. A skateboarding dog, what have you got for us?
Well, my skateboarding dog is actually from Australia, and it's partly because, as you know, I think, Bernard, I've got a slight obsession with that New Zealand app that's been created, which tracks great white sharks that are living down in Bowentown near Waihi, and they've got names like Daisy and Marybelle and Bruce, and they're swimming around, and they go up and down the coast, right up to Great Barrier, around into the Waitemata, and sort of hang off outside Waihi. So I don't go in the water now unless I look at that app. I mean, I don't have to look at it so much in Spain because I presume they're not quite getting over here. But it was
Maybe
a
they're following
fabulous-
you.
Yeah, fabulous classic Australian story this week of a fisherman being found inside a crocodile about 6 days after he went missing, and it looks like that he was eaten by a 4.1 meter crocodile and its 2.8 meter colleague, and it looks like he was dragged into the sea, into the water and eaten. And the police said, quote, "It could have happened for sure. There was a noise, a loud yell, and the sound of water splashing."
That was it.
So that's how it goes. Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah, well-
I love those Australian. I love those Australian stories. But as I say, as somebody who tracks great whites off the Bay of Plenty, it makes me nervous.
Daisy is coming to get you.
Yeah,
And Bruce,
exactly.
Bruce,
I don't want
for
to know
those.
if Daisy takes a bite out of me. I want her to take the whole lot straight away.
In a gulp. Yeah, no, Daisy. And Bruce, very sad
I
to
don't
hear
think
of the
there is
post.
actually one called Bruce. I'll take a look at Bruce.
Oh, yeah, well, for those who have watched Finding Nemo 100 times, because that was when their
Oh,
kids
yeah.
came out, Bruce, fish are friends. One of the great characters in animation, Barry
Oh, yeah.
Humphries,
That
who
was
of
Barry
course
Humphries.
died.
Was Bruce a great white?
Yeah, but
Yes,
he
he
was one
was,
of
I
those
think, yeah.
great whites who became a vegetarian shark. It was a great moment in animation. Peter, lovely to see you. I hope you have a safe
to see you
trip
too,
back.
Bernard.
Is that right? You're on your
Well,
way
no,
back.
no, no. I'll be doing the Hoon from here again next week.
Ah,
Yeah, or we could do it from Tangier on earlier in the week if you wanted to, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday next week. Not to tell the entire world exactly where I'm going, but I'll be back.
Yeah.
Here. I'll be in this location next Friday.
fantastic. Ka kite anō, everyone. This has been The Hoon. I've been Bernard
See you,
Hickey, and we've been with Peter Bale on The Hoon for Friday, May the 5th. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.